I live and work in the city, in a fairly large city in the north of England. And like a lot of other people who work in cities, I need to get away. And the place I like to get to, more than any other, is the Lake District. So here, at Bassenthwaite, I come for a geographical change. I like the spread of the landscape around me, the lakes like Bassenthwaite down below. I love the heights, like Skiddaw over there, under the cloud. And unlike a lot of people, when I come to the Lake District, I don't come here to find the place that Wordsworth wrote about with nodding daffodils and clouds in the sky, the sort of beautiful place that draws tourists. I like to come here because I like the wind and I like the ruggedness. I like the fact that it rains here, and I like walking in the fells. And I suppose that's because I'm looking for more than a change of scenery. I'm looking for a change of culture. The poems in this anthology, and I'm looking at section 1 here, have some very common themes. And as a reader, I enjoy the fact that I can find different moods and different attitudes in the poems. But I'm also an examiner. And I look at poems sometimes as a reader, where the poems are matters of pleasure, and sometimes I look at them as a teacher and as an examiner in a very different way. And I think you, when you read these poems, can enjoy them, and that's fine. You can talk about them and the differences from your own lives. But it's worth remembering that examiners look at the poems in a slightly different way. I think that really there are very few questions that can be asked about these poems. I think really there are probably only 3 or 4 questions in the end which are worth asking about the poems. The first question is this one. What do we learn about the other cultures from reading these poems? And the second question that's worth asking is, what do we learn about the writers of these poems about other cultures? And clearly, if we're studying the poems as part of an English course, we want to know something about how language is used and how devices are used to help meaning and to express feelings and ideas. So a third area of questioning can be about the style in which these poems are written. And I think it's worth looking at those in detail. What do we learn about other cultures from these poems? These 8 poems have got something quite remarkably in common. Each one of them, in a different way, says something about the joy of being in a different culture or the special qualities of that culture. And sometimes it's a matter of what people do or the conditions they live in, but they all have something positive to say. For example, take Limbo. Limbo is a poem in which Brathwaite celebrates the energy and the rhythm of dance and physical movement. He even makes it seem special and even spiritual by using phrases like, "The dumb gods are raising me." It's very interesting too that he sees that this physical activity has a benefit for repairing the damage or the hurt caused by bad experiences. He writes, "The music is saving me." So that's a very positive thing we get about a culture in which this sort of physical movement has been handed down from the past. Even in a poem like Nothing's Changed, which is quite an angry poem, and justifiably angry, there's something in there which is celebrating the old community that lived in this derelict and not very glamorous District 6, the place where Tetum Kulu Africa grew roots, as he puts it. You can sense a fondness for the old place when he speaks on this tape elsewhere about his memory of the house he lived in with its rickety balcony. But you can also see it in the poem, something positive about the way he admires the simple, ordinary pleasures of living in this community, even today, when he speaks about the pleasure of eating bunny chows at a plastic table and wiping your fingers on your jeans. He prefers these simple pleasures to the sophisticated and expensive plate glass and crushed ice, clean linen smart restaurants that have replaced the old community. And Island Man wonderfully suggests how exotic and delightful the sounds and colours are of that part of the Caribbean. It's got details of seashore and birdsong and vegetation. And Grace Nichols suggests the unpolluted beauty of this far-off island by giving details of the wild birds, its blue surf, and the emerald greenness of a place that gives life to a person who grew up there and continues to give life even when you've left that island. I think it's fascinating that an island like that has that creative power of giving life, as she suggests with that word, wombing. Blessing is another poem which brings out something precious and valued in a community in a way which is perhaps surprising, because we don't normally think of water as something that's of immense beauty or value. But if water is rare, and in large parts of this planet it is cruelly and painfully rare, sudden appearances of water must seem like a gift, even a gift from whatever gods there are who give these things. Like Braithwaite, and it's always worth making comparisons between these poems, remember. Like Braithwaite, she makes this precious thing seem special by referring to it as a gift from the gods and using religious terms such as congregation instead of crowd. And in the word itself, blessing, which is something you usually associate with a priest in a church. I like the way she says elsewhere in this tape that in England it's not water that changes things and gives people joy, it's sunshine. Watch the way people's behaviour changes when the sun shines in the UK. And then two scavengers in a truck. What a different culture is being described here. Away from the impoverished third world area where water is precious, suddenly a world of tall apartments and factories and highways and glitzy apartments and people driving around in a Mercedes. I think what we get from this poem is a celebration of the city as something bright and glitzy and sophisticated. And we get from these two people in the car, well dressed, their hair immaculately so, a vision of life in the USA as though it's as perfect as life can never be. As it can be only in the advertisements. And here the advertisement is for a product called America. And then again, back away from that sort of urban landscape and those sort of people to Scorpion, to a primitive hut in a lonely village without medical care, but something celebrated here, which is the simple trust and faith, you could say the primitive innocence of the villagers who come gathering around when somebody's been stung by a scorpion. And they say it's the work of the devil, and so they pray to remove the poison and the pain. So, something about the community spirit, the support and the help, and the faith that this writer has made precious, and perhaps something that we don't notice very much in our own lives here. And then, in Vultures, an extraordinarily worrying poem about human beings. There is something in this poem about evil and brutality that is beautiful if you want to see it. And there are two ways of looking at the poem, of course. You can be positive, you can be negative. But what is in the positive view of the culture of humanity, which really is the subject of this poem, is that even in an ogre, even in a monster, even in a man who spends his day poisoning people in a concentration camp, there may be, just left somewhere, one small, as the writer Achebe puts it, one small, tiny glowworm of tenderness, even in an ogre, that makes us feel positive about even the worst of human experience. And I still think, on the vein of the positive that these poems show us in other cultures, that what were they like has a positive side to it. Sad though the poem is, because what's beautiful is what's lost in this poem. But here's a poem that makes somebody else's culture, the Vietnamese peasant culture, seem peaceful and productive, gentle and harmless. Especially in the lines, peaceful clouds were reflected in the paddies, and the water buffalo
stepped surely along the terraces. I love that. The way the water buffalo stepped surely. They're used to it. They're established. The water buffalo are part of a long-established culture, and the terraces have been made long ago. And you can think for hours about the beauty of the singing of the Vietnamese people, which is described here as like the flight of moths in moonlight. I keep puzzling over this one. It suggests something gentle and fragile, something tender and easily hurt and lost. But in all of these poems, all 8 of them, we can learn something about other cultures. And then once we've learnt that, we've also learned something, I think, about our own culture too. I'm still thinking of the sort of questions which examiners might want to ask about these poems. And I'm still with this question, what do we learn about other cultures from these poems? I've just gone through some of the things that we learn that are interesting and pleasant and perhaps might make us want to go and share these cultures. But these poems are not part of some tourist brochure. They're poems which also remind us that wherever there's good, there's another side. Let's look at the 8 poems again and take a different look at what these writers are showing us. Limbo. I said it evokes something of the spiritual joy and the strength and the health of community rhythm and dance. But of course it's a poem which shows that that was necessary to keep up spirits at a time when people were being transported from their homes and sold into slavery. And the background of slavery in the culture from which Limbo as a poem emerges is something we can't ignore. And Brathwaite makes sure we don't ignore this. He speaks about the dark deck is slavery. He mentions the stick. He mentions the whip. And in this poem there is a stern reminder that sometimes human beings need what is most precious in their culture when their whole culture is most under threat. In Nothing's Changed, which is, as I said, an angry poem, there's a depiction of the destruction of a community and its replacement by a modern town with modern amenities and restaurants, which you might think is progress. But in this case, as the writer reminds us, nothing's changed. The new glitzy restaurants with all their facilities and all the modernities still actually incorporate the iniquity of racial segregation. They're fine for those who can afford them and who have got the right skin colour. But this is a poem that makes us realise that divisions in communities and in cultures are sometimes cruelly enforced, and you fall foul of them if you try to break through these conventions. And you can understand why Tatamkula Africa wants to throw a stone through that beautiful glass window behind which is the world from which he is forbidden. Much more joyfully, Island Man, we've already said, brings back all the colour of that beautiful island. But we shouldn't forget either that this man who remembers the island doesn't live there any longer, presumably because there wasn't work for him. He's had to leave this beautiful place to come to the dismal weather and bleakness of England and an English winter and the roar of traffic in London, not because he wanted to find these exotic parts of another life, but because he had to. He's a migrant. And again, it reminds us that sometimes people move for economic reasons, not just because they want to travel.